Now can I get into heaven?
No.
Hello and welcome to Masters of Divinity. I am your moderator, and I am here. My name is JP, by the way, and I am here with Father Chuck.
Hi, I'm Father Chuck, by the way.
If you're wondering where Matt is, the last month or so, he's been in this alternate reality that's sort of created based on like all the sitcoms he grew up watching, and he just refuses to leave. So it's probably going to be a while before we see him again. I think we're at 80s right now, Family Ties era.
Yeah, I was on board with everything he was doing, right? Because you're following it from the 50s and the 60s, and it's
Sure.
and it's his family just reinterpreted in different generations, right? So it's like I Dream of Jeannie kind of thing. I get it, whatever. But when he started to riff on family matters, that's when I felt things got really inappropriate.
Oh yeah, that's a little.
And Fresh Prince,
Yeah, especially so once he started growing a fade, that looked weird.
it did look weird. These jokes are just going to get worse and worse. Maybe this is what we do. We just they progressively worse and worse until he like comes back.
Until we just start doing full episodes where we just like make fun of Matt. He has no choice.
But he's living up to the occasional, and that's good.
One thing I wanted to go over real quick. In our heaven episode, we asked people what their idea of hell is, and we would say it.
Yeah, Mike made a comment that we sort of nailed his.
Okay, so Ben says his idea of hell is boredom. Nothing to do, nothing to keep me occupied, just alone with my thoughts.
Huh.
Which I thought was interesting because like that's kind of how I always understood purgatory.
Yeah, so like a silent retreat would just not be a good thing for Ben.
I guess not. And I could see that. I know, like, for me, if I'm, like, alone with my thoughts way too long, you kind of get into this sort of weird feedback loop.
See, this is years ago, there was a great reality show, which is very rare that the words great and reality TV go hand in hand. But there was this great reality show on the Learning Channel, on TLC, back when it was the Learning Channel. And it was following these guys who entered into a monastery, a Benedictine monastery, for the 40 days of Lent. You know, some guys were atheists, some guys were devout Catholics. One guy was studying to be an Episcopal priest. It was very fascinating. This was back in 2008. And on the first episode in Ash Wednesday, it's a full 24-hour period of silence, and all these guys have to join the monks in being in complete silence and solitude for like the full day or whatever, from like sunup to sundown. Maybe it was a full 24 hours, just sunup to sundown. And this one guy was just like talking about how he just did not like being alone with his thoughts. It just really bothered him, and I didn't understand that. And so now, like, here's you like telling me that,
Yeah.
so it's an interesting thing. Cause like, so I don't know what that's like. Cause like for me, like I spend a lot of time by myself in the quiet, and
I think it's just
alone with
like
my thoughts.
if it's too much time, like I'm an introverted person by nature, which is something about myself that I don't like. Like I wish I was extroverted. But the idea of being alone with my thoughts, I don't know, because like I can psych myself out. You know what I mean? Like I can't always control like where I go in the mental rabbit hole.
Like I can see that.
And it's like I think for a time it's good. It's very good actually. But then after a while it's like, man, I need something to like bounce this off of, not just myself, if that makes sense. So anyway, thanks Ben for letting us know about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, and I can also see why you say that you would consider that more purgatory-ish than hellish.
Right. I'm excited for this episode because, like I said in the last episode, I don't know anything about purgatory. I've never studied it. I've never really read up on it. I've never done anything in depth. I was always taught that it was just a thing some Catholics believed, and that it was used as a kind of scam by the Catholic Church to get like people to give more offerings to the church for like loved ones who had died, and they weren't really sure if they were going to heaven or hell.
Right. You're talking about the indulgences
Is that
controversy that really, really pissed off old Martin Luther. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Skimming Dante, it seemed like a place you go to pay for your sins, to cleanse oneself for paradise, like a spiritual gym, you know? Because I remember some of the things they're doing were very like physically laborious.
Mm-hmm.
You had like, you had historical figures on the speed bag. I don't know. I couldn't think of like a historical figure who might be in purgatory. That would take a whole lot of concentration.
You got like, I don't know, like Malcolm X doing like free weights.
Jumping rope. The medicine ball.
Gandhi's in there. Yeah. Gandhi's in there just doing like squat thrusts.
And it's all like old timey weights, like
like the kettle belt, like legit old school kettlebells.
Yeah, like the dumbbells are just like big iron balls, like, and everyone has like giant mustaches. I don't know.
And they're wearing like leopard print, like what, like what's it, like singlets?
Yeah. So that's how I always imagine purgatory, Chuck. Am I close?
A gym in the 1910s.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I say all that to ask you because I'm sure there are many people who listen to the podcast who don't know, who are on sort of the same boat as I am. What is purgatory?
It's actually a more complicated question to answer than it might seem, right? And I'll say to you, I mean, I'm still relatively new to the concept of purgatory. I mean, obviously, it's something that's in parts of my tradition as an Anglican Christian, so I know, and I studied it in seminary, so I know a little bit about it. So purgatory, like I said, it's tough to define because when you're talking about purgatory as is conventionally understood in our language, you are referring to a specifically Roman Catholic doctrine that refers to some state of being following death where one is they have unconfessed venial sins that they are having to deal with. They're being purged of those unconfessed sins. Because Roman Catholic Church makes a distinction between mortal sins and venial sins. Mortal sins or sins unto death are sins that are like unforgivable. Whereas venial sins, your little white lies, your momentary lusts, those kinds of things are the sins that sometimes you rack them up all the time, right? And so you're having to be purged of them. And I think even these days the Catholic Church would recognize systemic sins as part of this. Things that you buy cheap clothes that are made by slaves, right? So you've participated in systemic evil, and so somehow that's got to be purged out of you as well. But it's this place that it's a state of being following death where these unconfessed sins are being removed so that you may purely enter into heaven. It is traditionally conceived of as being a place of fire, sometimes even seen as maybe like in the neighborhood, like the same neighborhood of hell, like it's an exurb of hell or something, where you go, but the fire there is different than the fire of damnation. And it is a place of, we all have to kind of go, that most of us, and that's the thing is actually most Catholic doctrine would say that most of us would probably go through purgatory, following death. Now what purgatory represents, this idea that that there is an intermediate state between this life and entering into paradise. That's actually fairly well attested throughout much of the church. The Eastern Orthodox Church did not jump on board with the codified doctrine of purgatory in the sense of it being this separate space. They have a much more nuanced view of it, and that's kind of related to what we talked about last week with this idea that that hell could be seen as the experience of God's grace, but from one who has scorned God. And so because of that, for them, the big question is whether or not hell is permanent and whether someone might be able to be delivered from the fires of hell. So they don't necessarily Eastern Orthodox Christians don't necessarily hold on to this idea of a separate space for this purgation. They're open to the idea that hell might actually be, like escapable or leavable at some point after people have dealt with after this sin aspect of people's lives have been dealt with. And again, that's very well attested. I mean, that kind of thing goes all the way back to Gregory the Great and his interpretation of a passage of scripture in Matthew chapter 12, I think, where Jesus talks about having to things being tried by fire and that sort of thing. So and that's where that language originally comes from. So that's sort of a complicated answer for the question, but it's there's only the two ways you have to deal with it, right? There is the doctrine, the Catholic doctrine piece, and then there's this broader concept that is well attested in the Christian tradition outside of the Roman Catholic Church.
I think it's interesting that you kind of touched on that it's not necessarily like a temporary hell, because that seems to be like my little bit of research I did before this episode. I know that C.S. Lewis believed in purgatory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of had his own ideas of what that is, and how close was what he believed to sort of what you described.
So C.S. Lewis, he writes about it in this book called The Great Divorce. This is a book that it's one of his more interesting and more developed fiction books. It opens that he basically keeled over dead at his desk and finds himself in what he calls the Gray City. And it's just this vast, huge city where the distances between houses are greater and greater because it's everybody just in their very isolated, individualistic bubbles away from everyone. And that's actually his...
It sounds like Oklahoma, to be honest. I think Norman is called the Gray City. Yeah.
Nebraska, right? Like parts of Baton, Nebraska, like that. Yeah, it's but it's this, he says it's sort of like a city at dusk, but sunset never comes or whatever. But then he comes upon this, this bus depot where there are people just sort of milling about, and this bus comes and people get on it, and then it flies. The bus takes off and it flies, and it brings them to this beautiful, green, rich valley with mountains in the distance. And
this is beginning to sound like Totoro.
Yeah, kind of. Well, similar to Totoro, when the people in the bus like get outside, they realize they're transparent. They look like ghosts.
Okay.
And so they're kind of like the little Totoro that May first sees, who's semi-transparent. So like they're barely there. And the idea being that they're at the threshold of the heavenly realms, and heaven is more real than our reality. And so these people realize that they're less real, and so they're like ghosts. And angelic beings and people come across the mountain into the valley where the people are. And what happens throughout the course of this book are these conversations with these people, beckoning them to come into the mountain range, like into this beautiful place. And they're telling them this gorgeous place is totally available to you. But two things happen. One is people experience pain when they walk on the grass because the grass is unyielding to them because, again, it's more real. And at one point, an angel explains, I think it's to C.S. Lewis, his character in the book, I think it's him, but it might be someone else, explaining that, like, your feet will toughen up in time. As you make the journey, your feet will toughen up. You'll be able to handle it. And then it becomes this whole other thing where, like, there's one really, the story that stuck to me is this mother, like single mother of an only child, whose child had died. And this angel, I think it's like Gabriel or Michael, it's like one of the big deal angels, shows up and is like, hey, your kid is having a great time. So, I want to bring you to him. And she's like, well, why couldn't my son come to me? And the angel's like, well, I know where he's at, so just come with me and you'll see him. And anyway, basically the mother rejects the angel's invitation into the heavenly realm because it's not on her terms. And so, like, and that's kind of what happens throughout many of the accounts of these people. They're given this opportunity to enter into heaven, but because it's not on their terms, they just don't take it, and they get back on the bus and wait for the bus to go back to the Gray City. Some people go on. But that, like, threshold right there is basically Lewis's depiction of purgatory. It's that, it's like, I guess it's the whole motion, right? The idea that you've gone from the Gray City to the threshold of heaven, but like that idea that, you're going to have to accept things that are not on your terms, and you're going to have to suffer some kind of pain, building up the tolerance and the strength to be able to make the journey, right? So in that way, it actually fits with your idea of like what Dante said about, this being like a gymnasium, right? It's physical labor, physical exertion. You're actually, you're being prepared to be able to enter into this place. So it breaks from the classical and more antiquated idea that it's fire, which I want to talk about that in a bit, why we use fire in the traditional language. But it breaks from that and makes it more about like that sense of trial and that sense of effort and work and that sort of thing. Yeah, that's Lewis's version of it.
So was he inspired by the Catholic doctrine of purgatory to sort of come up with that?
From what I gather from my studies of Lewis, he, Matt and I took a class on C.S. Lewis, and so we talked about this book a lot in that class. He was influenced by Origen, Origen, famous theologian from like the 300s, I think, very controversial. He's sort of the big guy in terms of universalism and the idea of universal salvation. So Lewis was influenced by him. It seems that he was also influenced by a woman named, Catherine of Genoa, who was a 1400s theologian who wrote her treatise on purgatory. And reading through the little summary I have of it, it's very much that kind of idea that, there's work and that there's effort that has to go into it or whatever. So those seem to be two of the big influences on Lewis.
I mean, that's interesting because, Lewis was Protestant, like he wasn't Roman Catholic at all.
Right.
And
but he was converted to Christianity by Tolkien, who was unbelievably Catholic. So I'm sure some element of that got into him.
Yeah. It's just funny because it's like how many people did we know at our very Protestant college, kiss the ground that C.S. Lewis walked on?
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how many people because I actually never knew this about C.S. Lewis, that he believed this until now. So it's just kind of interesting because there's so many people who I knew that were like obsessed with Lewis, and I was wondering, I'm wondering now, did they believe the same things he did about like purgatory and stuff? Because they never mentioned it to me. So
were these people of the Calvinist persuasion?
Oh yeah. I mean, it was all across the board, to be honest.
There's a really fascinating thing that went on, particularly in the early to mid 2000s, where there was this big resurgence in interest in C.S. Lewis, and like evangelicals and Catholics kept trying to claim him, which I found very fascinating. I saw a book that PBA had in their library once where this like Catholic author made the argument that had Lewis lived longer, he would have made the jump over to Catholicism.
Interesting. I don't know why.
I'm like,
when you said that you had there were Catholics and Protestants trying to claim C.S. Lewis, I just imagined like Arwen holding onto C.S. Lewis on her horse, and like the Catholics all like on black horses as the ring wraiths, and she's like, "If you want him, come and claim him." He's Anthony. I'm like envisioning the Anthony Hopkins C.S. Lewis, from Shadowlands. I don't know.
Yeah, I that's why we've talked about. At some point we're going to do an episode on C.S. Lewis because he's such a huge figure in the church, and there's just been this big, resurgence and interest in him, particularly his, the work outside of like mere Christianity and the Chronicles of Narnia.
Do you think that resurgence happened because of Lord of the Rings' sudden surge of popularity in the early 2000s because of the movie? So like people got to know Tolkien and they found out that he was good friends with C.S. Lewis and...
I do, and I also think that somewhere along the way, someone figured out that Lewis was very much in support of smoking and beer drinking, and suddenly, like, a whole bunch of Christians our age were like, here's someone we can now, like, hold up as, because Mere Christianity was, like, a huge book when I was a teenager, being used as a book for, understanding Christianity or whatever. So the idea, and you find out that this hallowed figure was also a beer drinker and a smoker, and that was like the thing you wanted to do, right? Smoke a pipe and drink beer. So
not us, though.
Then suddenly, like, Lewis is your guy. I really think it boils down to that.
Yeah. Not us, though. We weren't.
I totally was. What are you talking about?
We totally were, yeah. I mean, you had a few pipes. I borrowed one once, a couple times.
I still have my church warden. Somewhere. My big, long... Gandalf pipe.
Oh, I want one so bad. I would probably never smoke it, but I want one so bad. I remember you used to have a corncob pipe that you used to call Corny Feldman,
and I had like a sort of a Corny Feldman. I forgot about that. And then I also had the I had like the Sherlock Holmes
Yeah. Yeah.
Doctor was it Dr. Grabow?
Oh yeah,
Whatever.
and I got you one in China that was like this giant pipe, but had
A
like a really,
dragon.
it had like a really small bowl though, and we were like, oh, this might be like an opium pipe.
Totally a weed pipe, dude. You bought me a weed pipe.
Yeah. Well, technically, as a cannabis connoisseur, you actually can't smoke cannabis out of a wooden pipe because the resin would get stuck, and you have to use glass. So
It's clay.
you can't use clay either. I wouldn't use clay either.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's hard to wash out.
Well,
it gets clogged.
Well,
anyway,
I don't know if I don't think I even have that thing anymore. If it does, in my mom's garage.
Nice.
But yes. So I think that's a big part of it though too. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting how we pick and choose, right? Yeah. Also, I mean, case in point, right? Another good example of this is in this conversation is Mel Gibson's the Passion of the Christ was huge when we were in college. Remember, like our university bought tickets for us to go see it, right?
Yeah, that's how
evangelicals everywhere just gravitating to this movie. And like because I had enough exposure to the Catholic Church by that point, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the Stations of the Cross. Like this is the most Catholic Jesus movie I've ever seen. And it's based on like these bizarre visions of this like kind of crazy nun, and obviously Mel Gibson is like ultra conservative Catholic, right. And so here the other good thing, evangelicals leech onto it, but they seem to kind of miss the other stuff, right. Or the stuff they don't want. But anyway, we're not here to pile on evangelicals.
No. Okay, so then Purgatory, a place of purification, you said. So what is that purification supposed to look like? I mean, is it? I know Dante is very poetic in how he describes things. I don't really remember what they were. I really don't. But like, well, what does that look like? Is it just like just wrestling with the soul? I hate to envision Purgatory as like a place where it's like flagellating themselves. Yeah, like, because that sounds bad. That sounds like you have to abuse yourself before you go into heaven, like self-destructive.
Which I take, right, and I take umbrage at that idea because it seems to suggest that our ultimate salvation is contingent on work that we can do. So to kind of answer to get to it a little bit, there's a passage in the Bible that I'll read that is used as like the clearest purgatory passage in the Bible, and this is 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 and following, and I'm reading from the Common English Bible. No one can lay any other foundation besides the one that is already laid, which is Jesus Christ. So whether someone builds on top of the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, grass, or hay, each one's work will be clearly shown. The day will make it clear because it will be revealed with fire. The fire will test the quality of each one's work. If anyone's work survives, they'll get a reward. But if anyone's work goes up in flames, they'll lose it. However, they find themselves will be saved as if they had gone through a fire. So there was like a weird comment in there that didn't need to be there. So the idea here is that in what the church has long seen in this passage is that Paul is acknowledging that there will come a time where one's work will be tried by fire. And so this is using the image of building a house. Now you have to remember that in the ancient world, a very real concern, really up until the invention of electricity, a major concern in any construction was fire, because, people got light by using candles. They had fires in their homes, like cooking fires, so the idea that one's house could burn down was a very real possibility. Really well-made house is going to survive a fire. So that's the image that Paul is using here, is saying, it doesn't matter what you put on it, right? The quality the quality of the work is what's going to matter, right? So if you use like straw or hay, obviously that's going to burn away. Gold, silver, those different things, like that's all going to, that's going to depend on, on the quality of the materials used. And so, Paul's using the idea of work as the idea. So the notion here then is that the work we do as people is what's going to be put to the test. And the good things that we do will remain and indeed become better. Because if we look at the, well, I'll get to that in a moment because I don't want to get ahead of myself. But those bad things that we do, those things are like hay and straw, and they'll eventually just burn away. And so when we come through, all the extraneous stuff will be gone. But what is right and good and you know, the best of us will remain. I want to take a moment just to pause, because fire is an important thing we talk about here. Because in our world today, when we talk about, like, if you're going into the afterlife and there's fire, right, we see it as punishment. We see hell, right? We think of it as a place primarily of suffering. And that's largely because our relationship with fire in our electronic age is almost entirely negative. You know, we don't, you know, if we light candles or anything like that, like, we do it because it's sort of like, you know, fun, right? We don't need to do it. The imagery of fire primarily in the Bible is of light and of purity. I don't know if I mentioned this in this podcast or not, but the Bible, as we understand it, was actually put together during the Babylonian captivity. So the Babylonians were, some of them were Zoroastrian. Like, the Zoroastrian religion was a big part of that world, the Persian world, that, you know, in addition to other things. So Zoroastrianism was a big deal. And Zoroastrianism worshipped fire and water. And so the influences of Zoroastrianism on the thought of Jews during this time is huge. According to scholars, I'm just citing other, you know, things I've read over the years. You know, you're a persecuted people in a foreign empire, and you're trying to articulate, you know, your God, right? You're going to use the imagery of the people around you to kind of illustrate, you know, like, you know, our God is the God of fire, and the Zoroastrian is going to be like, oh, cool, okay, well, your God's pretty awesome, so we'll just leave you alone, right? Like, that's what it comes down to. It doesn't mean it's not true, just, you know, part of that language as well. But you think about, like, you know, the decisive, like, the big decisive moment in Jewish history is when Moses speaks to God, and God appears to him as a burning bush that the bush is never consumed, right? So it's a fire, but it's not a consuming fire, even though later, I guess, it is depicted as a consuming fire, because when God appears to Moses on the top of Sinai, it's a consuming fire. But God regularly appears throughout the book of Exodus and early on as fire, right? And so and I think that symbol is very important, because it shows that there's that multi-pronged nature, that God is a source of light, a source of warmth, a source of nourishment, right? Because we need fire to cook, right? That's something that, you know, humans evolved to have to cook or ferment our food in order to eat it. We can't actually eat raw food, you know, all that well. Like, our bodies don't digest it, you know, so we learned we had to cook. You know, but at the same time, fire is also destructive and can cause pain. And so it's, you know, that relationship with fire is important, right? You want to be in a right relationship with it rather than the wrong relationship with it. So you can kind of almost see where the similarities with God and fire are there in the theology that's kind of, you know, sort of the kernel of this idea in the theology of the scriptures. You know, you want all the good things of it, right? But when you have the bad relationship, or, you know, with fire, that's when you get hurt or things get destroyed. But overwhelmingly, right, the Bible will talk about, you know, gold tried in a furnace, right? The idea of removal of dross, right? You take a piece of metal, like you find gold, right? You dig it up, and then what you do is you put it through really hot fire. And what happens is all the impurities of the gold melt away. And eventually you can separate the pure gold away from the impurities. So that's part of the image as well, is this idea of something being tried through fire. Again, the removal of what, you know, the removal of what's extraneous, so that what's right and true and good can remain. And so I think, like, as people, we recognize that. I think if we look at ourselves as individuals, right, there are times where we're like, you know, like, this is really who I am, and this is when I'm at my best. You know, we look at the mistakes we make or the things we do, and we're like, why did I do that? That was so out of character for me. Or this didn't, you know, that was such a dumb thing for me to do. Like, why did I make those mistakes, right? You're talking about, you know, you get alone with your thoughts for a while, right? Like, you know, I know that, you know, there are times where I have that same kind of thing where you can't control the rabbit hole, and you start thinking about, like, stupid stuff you did in high school, or, you know, decisions you made, or like for me, it's like, why did I pine after that girl all that long? Like, what a stupid thing, you know? You know, so you see the decisions you make and the things like that, and you wish that they were gone, right? You don't want those parts of you in your life anymore. You want just what's best of you to remain. So the idea is that there is this process that takes place as we are being further brought into our more perfect selves. As we are told in the New Testament, we are being conformed to the image of Christ, right? So that idea of conformity, the idea of being shaped and molded, painted into a picture, that reflects Christ. That means that, all the other stuff is going away. How that happens, right? Again, they use the scripture writers early on used the image of fire because that was the best illustration they could come up with for something that could remove impurities or could remove straw, hay, empty stuff, right? You burned it and it disappeared. But as we've progressed in our society, I think the metaphors are different. I think that C.S. Lewis captures a really interesting way of talking about it, right? Which is, basically like learning to walk again. But either way, it's the same idea. It's that we are in the process of being shaped into the kind of people that God wants us to be. Now, what I like about C.S. Lewis's depiction of this is that it's not just, me in the gym lifting weights in order to bulk myself up to come and enter into heaven or whatever. It's someone is walking with me. Someone, God has sent someone in C.S. Lewis's model, whether it's an angel or someone that I know, or some hero of the faith or whatever, that they're sort of walking along with you in this process. And so it's not just you, it's someone, with, experience, or it's someone, coming from God that's saying, here's the thing that you need. Here's the process that we need to work on. Here's, this is what God really wants from you, right? So it's less, oh, I'm doing this suffering so I can pay for these sins myself. Right? To me, it's a continuation of the work that Jesus began on the cross. And so it's all part of it, right? This, of course, is a problem for Protestants because we like to believe that it's a very simple, snap your fingers. You say your prayer, you're converted, done. It's all set, it's over. But, even the Bible tells us that, has Paul saying, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. There's this pretty implicit knowledge that salvation is a process. Right. And I think it might be a process that continues even after we die.
It's like you sometimes got to call on the Nintendo helpline, right?
Exactly. That's actually really good. Yeah, just like when I worked at EB Games, and somebody was they were stuck in EverQuest and they'd give us a call and be like, "Hey, yeah, I'm fighting an ice giant. What do I do?" And I'd be like, "That's not my level. Let me get Blair."
I called in once to the Sega helpline. I had gotten Echo the Dolphin, and I just had no idea how to play it.
on Netflix, by the way, there's this really great video game documentary. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's like a 6-part series on the development of video games. And one episode deals with a guy who got a job working for the Nintendo helpline.
Oh, I watched that. Yeah.
Yeah, what an awesome job that dude had.
He had that these thick binders and how to play all these games and stuff. And they had to memorize it all. Oh, that would have been fun. You just have your mullet and your IROC Z and I help kids play video games.
See, that's what it is, man. That's what's going to happen. It's I'm going to wake up. My loved ones and everyone will be around me. It'll be the bright light, and then suddenly I'm on my futon in my game room in my house in Pine Hills. Yeah. And I got a controller in my hand. And then there's this game. And that game is my life, and I have to play it. And,
so just a little pixel chuck.
Then coming and sitting next to me is I don't know, St. John or somebody being slap me on the leg and be like, all right, let's get through this together. Or what if Purgatory is Clippy?
That makes sense. Yeah.
It's just you live your life over, but Clippy is there the whole time.
All right, that's how I'm relating to it. When I think of that, it's sometimes you need the representative to walk you through it every now and then. Mm-hmm. Makes sense. But I don't know. I kind of like that too. I mean, it's like the spiritual act of transformation. Mm-hmm. That it's like that cliche of the phoenix rising from the ashes. But once you're cleansed, is that when you become the cocoon alien?
The alarm. Yes, JP. It's Jesus has ascended. He has gone on, right? Mm-hmm. And so we here on Earth, after he's ascended, we are basically in our little cocoons at the bottom of the ocean. Salvation is when Steve Gutenberg's boat came and pulled us out from the ocean, and they got us into that pool in the retirement home. And that's kind of an in-between state, right? We've been rescued from the ocean, but we're in this in-between state, waiting for the full redemption to take place, waiting for that moment that we're free. So that's our purgatory state. And then sometimes an old guy is pounding us on the side of the pool, right? And some of us don't make it, but the rest of us, when we do, we can come out of that cocoon as our full glowing selves.
And then we come back for a sequel that doesn't make any sense.
What I love about Cocoon 2 is it's one of those movies, kind of like it's one of those movies like Teen Wolf 2, that appears as an extra feature on the DVD of the first one.
Yeah. Moving along, now that we've gotten the Cocoon joke out of the way. So then, how do you think Purgatory? And this is, a question I've been asking, like, kind of all throughout the series, because I feel like this is like why these concepts exist. How do you think Purgatory would affect Christians and what they believe?
I think it comes down to, if we had a Catholic on the podcast, we could ask a Catholic, how does this, how does it affect you? But it's that sense of, like, there's a buffer. This life isn't a zero-sum game. And so the idea that, that it's not an all or nothing kind of deal, I think is probably an important reminder for Christians, and I think can really affect the way we live. That there's a graciousness.
Like, don't sweat the small stuff.
Yeah, don't sweat the small stuff. But I also think that you could look at it as a motivator to be better in this life too, because nobody wants to go to the gym. You know what I mean? Like, if everyone had the opportunity to just, like, bypass the gym, right? Like, most of us who are involved, like any of us who do go to the gym, right? We usually go to the gym because we didn't keep up with our, like, physical health from, like, high school until, now. And so, the idea that if we had just been, like, doing it all along, eating right all along, exercising regularly all along, then we would just never have to join a gym and then, like, just pay for something we never go to and feel guilt about all the time.
Yeah, and it's a nightmare. You've got that one guy in the corner grunting with every flex, and you got that one angel's going to be like, hey, I see you come here a lot. If you want my help, it's only like $500 a month. I can give you some extra pointers if you want.
Right.
You work on your form.
So then he helps you, but it pushes you too far, and then you're puking in the alley afterward.
Yeah, it just feels weird saying no to him anyway, because his job depends on you, and you're like, I'm just here to roll this rock up this mountain a few more times.
Right. Nice Sisyphus reference. So the idea that it could be a motivator to be like, hey, avoid purgatory, just pay attention to your stuff now. But so I think that would be, I can see how it would affect people differently. It would help Christians to maybe tone it, just to kind of relax a little bit, especially the Protestants. You know what I mean? Well, actually, now that I mention that, I'm going to take it to another level, because there's an angle of Protestant evangelicalism that we've hinted at a lot and we've addressed a little bit, but we haven't really talked about. It's an inaccurate statement, but you'll know what I mean when I say it, which is the once saved, always saved mentality.
Right. Yeah.
The idea that just because you said your prayer, like, you're somehow good with God, and so, like, even though you sin, like, it's not going to have any kind of lasting consequence on you, right? Which of course is beautiful and liberating, but there's plenty of Christians who sort of exploit that idea. That's like, oh, because I said my sinner's prayer and I got baptized, that, like, I'm good to go, and so anything I do now, like, is not held against me, and so then that becomes like an excuse to do jerky bad things. Like, nobody really feels they have to pay attention to their morality, and they don't have to pay attention to their behaviors anymore.
Oh yeah, I've met people firsthand who think that. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you introduce an idea to remind people that salvation is a process, it is growth, that probably helps temper some of those attitudes as well, I would think. The way we live is still, there's still something happening. And I do worry that, the approach of some of evangelical Protestantism, it's almost like they treat it's like the bonsai tree of spiritual growth. It's small, it's contained, it's not allowed to just fully bloom, right? And so, what's going to happen when you uproot that thing and you put it in the soil, right? Like, now it's got a ton of catch up. If you have in your mind this idea that there is a process involved in salvation, and that it's not a process you have to figure out in this world. It's you do have a bit of a buffer. It's both responsibility, but I think also an easing of a burden, because you don't have to figure it all out now. You should try, but it's not like you're going to get to your deathbed and you have to lay there and be like, crap. I said a lie in 3rd grade and I didn't get a chance to confess it. And then now you're like burning in hell or whatever,
So you think it would be nice if it were part of, like overall Christian doctrine?
Yeah. I mean, I think that because again, going back to the initial question we asked what purgatory is, I mean, I think the doctrine, the idea behind purgatory is embraced by a very large section of the church. Roman Catholics, Orthodox Christians. Those are the 2 largest Christian denominations in the world. So arguably the majority of Christians have some idea of this already. But I think like in America, because we are so shaped by Protestant Christianity, and particularly evangelical Protestant Christianity, and particularly evangelical Protestant Christianity by people who don't even know their own religion all that well, if I can be so blunt. I think that, yeah, this absolutely would be hugely beneficial. The problem, though, is that it doesn't work within the narrative of salvation that like we were presented with growing up.
It's because of how focused it is on like works. Is that what you mean? Like,
right. Yeah. I mean, I guess one could argue, if we're looking at purgatory as a place of sort of working through the stuff we need to do to achieve our salvation, I guess one could make the argument that purgatory is actually happening in this life rather than the life to come. But,
right.
But I think ultimately, when we just look at the kind of Protestant Christianity we grew up with, like that's just not how people conceive of it.
Yeah.
And so, what we're actually looking at is this salvation model that's like, because you said some magic words, like you're off the hook. And not, yeah, and I actually believe that, like, that's a liberating, freeing belief that, I don't think people, you're not destined for, hellfire and damnation, but that is also not an excuse to just sort of live your life very self-interestedly and sort of act like, well, because I'm good, like,
right. I guess it's just easier for us, people who grow up evangelical American society, whatever, binary is just easier to live by. Do this, don't do this. Yeah. Go over here, not over here.
And it's also that idea of well, I actually, when we get right down to it, I actually believe that our attitudes toward hell is largely based on revenge.
I think so too.
Yeah, we want to see certain people in hell.
Yeah, I mean, it's like
the idea.
Yeah.
I say, and the idea that someone might not go to hell, like we don't like that, especially if it's a Democrat.
Yeah, I think we also. Yeah, I think we also especially like the idea of someone in hell who like knows why they're there and they can't get out. I think that's
right.
That's what I said in the last episode.
Yeah, and it's cruelty. It's a piece of cruelty that we hold on to in our worldview that I just don't think is very consistent with the Christian gospel.
Right.
And so, I think once we can kind of get past that idea and we can open up the possibility, right, that it's not like die and go to hell, like, yeah, you get yours,
Right.
It's and I'm going to get mine because I know I'm going to heaven, right? It's right. This idea of we're actually trusting in God's mercy and grace, because we may find out that we have work still to do after we die. And so I think it makes us more reliant on God's mercy and grace in the way we live our lives, rather than thinking that we've accomplished it ourselves through our own, pulling ourselves up by our spiritual bootstraps or whatever.
Yeah, and it's a way to avoid having to be graceful and merciful, to fulfill right. those parts of Christianity, and just to kind of erase the the fire and brimstone aspect of it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you believe in purgatory?
I don't know that I believe in the Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory, because I don't know that I don't see a need for it. I'm much more persuaded by the idea that hell and purgatory are the same place, and that hell is an escapable place. I'm going to share something that I found for this episode, and it comes from the Cambridge Companion to Orthodox Christian Theology, and it's an article on eschatology, which is the fancy word for the end of the world, the end of all things, written by Bishop Hilarion Alfayev. But
what a hilarious name.
So he writes, according to many theological and liturgical texts of the Eastern Church, Christ, in his descent into hell, liberated all people from hell without exception. Truly, hell has been abolished by the resurrection of Christ. It is no longer unavoidable for people and no longer holds them under its power. But people recreate it for themselves each time sin is consciously committed and not followed by repentance. And he goes on to say that it's not, his issue with purgatory is this idea that it creates one's sense of remorse and sorrow, but doesn't provide opportunity for actual repentance. So he goes on to say, the Eastern Christian tradition never recognized the doctrine of purgatory and never made a distinction between eternal torments from which liberation is impossible and a fire of purgatory from which one can be saved. According to Orthodox teaching, it is possible to be freed from the torments of hell. The practice of praying for the departed and even for those in hell at Pentecost Vespers is based on this. However, this liberation occurs not because of some automatic necessity and not because the sinner serves a kind of prison term established for those who commit certain sins, but through the prayers of the church and God's ineffable love for man. Until the final verdict of the judge is pronounced, there is hope for all the departed to enter the kingdom of heaven. So the Orthodox idea then is that, like, you know, we don't, it's like, oh, well, you didn't confess this, so now you got to go and do your time or whatever. But rather this really intense idea of God's mercy and grace, and that, you know, we want people to escape it. And if we go into this other Orthodox idea that hell and heaven are really the same place, just shifted by our experience, right? That if we're talking about somebody who is put in a position where they realize through this painful proximity to God, you know, their wrongdoing, then they have the opportunity to change and to see this in a different perspective. Then they realize that state of being before them was a purgatory. It was them having to deal with some stuff they needed to deal with. And now they've actually repented. They've turned, you know, the metanoia. They've had the transformation that shifts their perspective to see God in his light and his mercy. So getting even back to that conversation we had around, you know, fire having its two sides, right? Once you have the right relationship with it, it's a healthy thing. And again, like this idea that we pray for people after they die, you know, hoping that, you know, our prayers are somehow doing something for them. You know, I just think it helps us be in a much more merciful state of being as Christians, and that, you know, we ultimately have to believe that God doesn't lose anything that God loves. So I do believe in a state after death where people who have sinned have to deal with those sins. But I don't believe in it in the sense of like arbitrary lists of venial and mortal sins. I think that there are some people whose lives are so defined by their sinfulness that they're going to have to deal with that, and God's going to deal with that with them after they die. And so I think that's really the bigger thing we're talking about here. And that gets back to something I said last week, which was, you know, what's more powerful, annihilation or transformation? And I think transformation is far more powerful. And I think the proper Christian posture for us is, we look at like some of the most wicked people we can think of, we should want them to be transformed. We shouldn't want them to be destroyed. I'll share a personal story. My attitudes on this really changed when Osama bin Laden was assassinated. Because I remember when I saw the news that he'd been assassinated, and I just felt really profound sadness. I was in my dorm in seminary. I think it was my senior year of seminary. And I felt just this profound sadness over bin Laden's death. And I was like, why do I feel so sad? And I remembered a conversation that I'd had with my youth pastor when we would go surfing together. He was talking just after 9/11. He was saying that he had taken to praying for Osama bin Laden's salvation, because he said, St. Paul had been a terrorist. He was a radicalized person. He was, a religiously radicalized person. And once he was converted, look what he could accomplish. He said, so imagine like what Osama bin Laden could accomplish if he were to have been converted. What would the world see, if Osama bin Laden had a dramatic conversion, if he could apply that kind of passion and energy to like the love of God for humanity and everything. And so I was sad when bin Laden died, because I realized, we were robbed of that. And that's not to say that killing him was bad. I think I sort of do sometimes buy, as much of a pacifist as I am, I sometimes do buy into that Star Wars idea that some people are too dangerous to be left alive. But I think that but at the same time, I think there's an inherent tragedy in that we didn't get to see what a redeemed bin Laden looked like in this world. And the world was robbed of the passion energy of that person who was corrupted by a very twisted thing. So I started to think about, well, the most loving thing for me is to want to see someone like him changed and transformed, not removed and destroyed and taken care of. And that's the more powerful victory in the long run, is the person who sees the error of their ways and changes. And which, by the way, is one of the reasons why I really, really, really despise the ending of Rise of Skywalker. Because it sets the whole movie up over the idea of healing Palpatine, and then just doesn't do that.
That's interesting. I thought you were going to say Kylo Ren.
Well, that too. I would love to have seen Kylo. I would love. You and I talked about that. I would love to have seen, a storyline where Ben Solo is now having to deal with the, facing the consequences of his sins.
Do you know what sprawling franchise ended that way, where all of the monsters or bad guys were healed and converted and were suddenly good?
The Matrix?
Nope. Power Rangers.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Now I'm interested in Power Rangers.
There was a. I can't believe we're going into this. This is how ridiculous our freaking podcast is. What a weird show.
Hey.
But there was this. I think it's called Day of the. I don't remember. I don't know. But it was the big sort of Avengers Endgame episode of Power Rangers where everybody came together. Even Bulk and Skull were there.
Right.
And Zordon defeated the ultimate evil by sacrificing himself, I think. And they released his energy or something, and it destroyed the bad guy. And then you saw Rita and Lord Zed were suddenly turned into just normal people, and they do the tango off camera. Lord Zed is in a polo shirt and khakis, and Rita looks Rita Repulsa looks like a mom,
Huh.
So
that's fascinating.
Yeah, Power Rangers ended that way.
I mentioned the Matrix. The Matrix does a similar thing, and people hated it. Right? The idea that Neo sacrifices himself for the sake of peace and coexistence, and that's what the movie ends. Is with the machines aren't defeated; they coexist.
Right. Yeah, because they all sort of represent parts of humanity and existence.
Right.
Zion represents the body. The Matrix represents the mind, and the machines represent the spirit, and they all have to live in harmony as one. And so everyone has the choice of whether or not they want to wake up in the Matrix or not.
Right.
It's a little bit of a mixed metaphor, though, because the Matrix is a system of control ultimately. So I don't know.
Right.
But I mean, at least that's how Cornel West described it. If you have the Matrix, listen to those commentaries; they'll blow your mind.
Yeah, well, and I just, and also that's a film series that people have been sleeping on, and because it didn't end with dingo boom.
Yeah, I know. Admittedly, I was one of them. I did not like it, but until recently, I started to really appreciate it. And I am stoked for the Matrix 4, aka the Matrix Resurrections. I'd like to talk about what I've learned, because this is our penultimate episode. We talked about heaven, we talked about hell, we just talked about purgatory, and then next week we're going to talk about Pixar's Soul as a way to kind of cap off the month and talk about the afterlife and stuff. But I want to talk about sort of what I've learned, and I think ultimately what I've learned, Chuck, through these discussions with you is that, the final destination is heaven.
Yep.
And I think that when it comes to scripture and stuff, that might be made the most clear, that any kind of idea about the afterlife, right? Like there's no sort of like vague mention of it that people have to like piece together. Like it says there will be a new Jerusalem, there will be heaven. We're all going to go there. You're going to be there with God, or it's going to come here. You know what I mean.
Right. Whether we go there, it comes here. The ultimate destination is heaven. Yes.
Yeah. So that is crystal clear in the scripture. You cannot misinterpret that.
Right. That is the trajectory of the story and creation. Yes.
Right. So concepts like hell, purgatory, or the stasis you go into when you die that we sort of mentioned throughout the episodes, it's all debatable. Like, and what we know, those concepts are just like a collage of different interpretations that have been synthesized by other people to create their own sort of narrative to make sense of the Christian journey. But the point of the end is that we are at peace. It's supposed to be at the end of a life that was used to make things better. Not just for you, but for the world and the people you share the world with. And it also kind of, I'm also kind of tying it back into my understanding of spirituality, which is that we are all connected in some way or another. Physically, spiritually, we are all connected. To me, that is spirituality. Right. And that as much as we try to separate ourselves from society, from each other, you can't escape that what you do will eventually affect somebody. Mm-hmm. And that's why you should be mindful of it. Not because you might go to hell, or you might get punished, or you'll be rewarded by going to heaven, but because, we're supposed to lessen the suffering here. And we should be doing it by any means necessary.
Can I interject a point real quick?
Go ahead.
So this, just because I'm doing a book study with my church, and the chapter we read brought this up, and I just thought it was an interesting addendum to what you're saying. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes about what's happening to this church in Corinth. That's just kind of a mess. There's all these divisions in the church. There's different camps of people who believe certain things. And on top of that, rich people and poor people have all kinds of tense relationships. And one of the things that's happening is when it comes to like the Sunday liturgy, the Eucharist, it was, typically in the ancient world, in the early church, worship services happened either before or after work, sometimes after work. And so what would happen is that the wealthy people would start the liturgy early. And while they were there, because the early worship of the church was like a communal meal. And so they would start this, and then they would get all the best cuts of meat, the best food, and then they'd leave the dregs for the poor and working class who had to come to church late after they got off work. Paul is furious about this. But what Paul says to the church, he says, because of your abuses of this supper, of the Lord's Supper, some of you have gotten sick and some of you have died. Now, we're studying at my church Dr. Richards' book, Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. Dr. Richards is a professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He co-wrote the book with one of his grad students by the name of Brandon O'Brien. And in this chapter where that we're studying actually tonight in my class, the tonight of recording, is about honor and shame. And the authors of the book point out that Paul is in an honor and shame culture. And what Paul is cautioning, he says, so, in our world, which is more of like a arbitrary right and wrong, individualist right and wrong kind of culture, we hear Paul's words saying that that because people are doing bad things, they're getting sick and dying while participating in this meal. Paul is actually not making the connection. He's not saying that the people who are getting sick and dying are the people doing the bad things. He is saying that as a result of the bad things, people are getting sick and dying. And so what he's basically getting at is that innocent people are suffering because of the abuses of other people. Now, one can even take it to a very practical level in that because they've started the meal early, by the time people are coming to the meal, the food is spoiled. And so they're getting sick because they're eating spoiled food. But either way, the point that Paul is trying to make is that, your actions have impacts on others. It's not about how it impacts you. It's how it impacts the people around you. And just reading it that way just really kind of blew my mind a little bit. Just reading that today, that it's that, Paul's not saying like, hey, do this so you can avoid hell. Do this so you can get to heaven. He's saying the behaviors you're doing are hurting people. And so you should be doing things that don't hurt people. And it's amazing how often we quote 1 Corinthians,
right?
But we use it so wrongly.
It's interesting because it also kind of reminds me, even though I haven't read the entire thing, but when I think about like the early like Jewish laws, the 600 laws, and like how arbitrary they feel. Don't eat shellfish. Right. Like, what does that mean? Okay, God hates shellfish for some reason. Like, no, like it's unhealthy. It could kill you.
Right.
There is a practical application to what's been set before you, right?
Right.
It's not just because it's like an act. You partake in it, you will actually be helping people.
Right.
Right.
Right. And fascinatingly, later in the Christian tradition where we see that Jesus, says like, don't call anything unclean, right? This whole idea of, the idea of the kosher laws are no longer applicable, right? What Jesus is addressing there is the fact that we took, we humans had taken this law that was meant to be kind of that, right? This practical sort of thing. But then we started applying all these moral qualities and moral categories to it, right? And so the idea that like we find a certain food repulsive, well, that means that people who eat that food are also repulsive, right? And so, right, so it's addressing that the way that we can take something that's meant to be good and twist it into something else.
I mean, it's like how people look at someone who might be an addict,
right?
When you should be looking at them as somebody who like needs help.
Yeah, well, and this actually addresses a really interesting thing, because I don't know if I've mentioned this here, but it's like here in Hawaii, homelessness is a really big issue in Honolulu, and particularly people who are drug addicted. Meth entered the United States through Hawaii, through Honolulu, and so there are definitely some tweakers running around outside my church from time to time, and when they show up, they don't always show up like looking for help. They just show up and cause a ruckus. Sometimes. And it's hard because I can look at these folks and like you're saying, they need help, but the kind of help they need is so beyond my pay grade, right? Like I can give you a sandwich. I can't make you clean,
right.
you know?
Yeah.
And so this gets to that conversation about how the way we live our faith is bigger than just our own individual bubbles. Right. It's about, this is when it starts even getting into our politics, right? Because we need people who are gifted and skilled in how to help these other people, right? Anyone will tell you that the reason why like drug addicted homeless people are running around on the street is because we don't have the services in place to help those folks.
Right.
And everybody else is trying to pass it off to someone else. And so, right. So like that's where this kind of social responsibility and our responsibility to each other comes into play, which becomes, very collectivistic, becomes borderline socialist. But there's a reason why the Book of Acts says that everybody in the church is selling all their possessions and giving to the people as they need. I mean, let's be honest, what's going on there, right?
Totally.
There's a recognition that we are responsible to and for each other. So
absolutely. And I say all that to make the point that, make no mistake, people are suffering. Forget about hell or purgatory. There's suffering all around us, like in our life now. And it's not good enough anymore to tell people, who are suffering that, well, it'll get better for you when you're dead.
Right.
There's something waiting for you on the other side. So, in the meantime, just bootstrap it, kiddo, right?
Right.
So, no, we're supposed to be making things better here, right now, today. And that is what I'm getting. And sure, I already knew that. But it's interesting that the afterlife could reinforce that so much.
Right.
when you think of the afterlife, oh, it's just like a place where I go, or it's just sort of a comforting thing, so I don't have to really do anything. No, no, no. The belief in the afterlife should enforce your beliefs that I need to be doing stuff now here.
Right. Well, and this is where the inevitable question comes up, and I'm sure there's got to be at least one of our listeners, viewers, that probably has broached this question, which is then, okay, well, if everybody's getting to heaven when all is said and done, what's the point of being Christian? Like, why not be anything? My answer to that is you're Christian because, for me as a Christian, I believe that this is the truth. The truth is that Jesus has saved us. And it's the idea for me that we, as a result of that knowledge, we are now liberated from, one, the burden of having to save ourselves, but also we have now been, our eyes have been opened to just a life defined by just profound gratitude. And that we should now, really kind of want everybody to know that, and everybody to know that liberation and know that freedom. And to know that is, going to involve, this idea of feeling, liberated is going to involve us doing things. It's not just like, oh, here's how you can feel good about yourself, but it's also, helping people rid themselves of the baggage that enslaves them. I think, I go back to the story of Exodus. One of the things that Christians really miss in that story is what Moses tells Pharaoh. Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go so that they can go back to their homeland and worship their God. So we love the whole, Charlton Heston, let my people go, right? Freedom for the sake of freedom. But that's actually not what they're called to do. They're called to be free so that they can worship. And so this idea for us as Christians, right, our job is to want everybody to worship with us, right? Like that's what we're supposed to be doing, right? Worship Jesus. We want you to all worship Jesus because that's, what conversion is all about. Well, if we look at the precedent set in the story of Exodus, then that means we have to do what's necessary to help people feel free to worship. If somebody's working 2-3 jobs because they can't put enough food on their plate, they don't have the energy to come to church. So maybe we should be trying to ease the burden so that they can come to church and worship. Or, if they're drug addicted, and they're passed out in an alley, it just becomes this whole bigger conversation for us as Christians, that it's not just about, advertising an idea. And then like you said, yeah, just pray to Jesus. And even though it's rough for you now, it's going to get better for you after you die.
Yeah. How convenient.
But it's more our, part of our work to be like, hey, we're all suffering and this good news has been proclaimed, and this good news is to make sure that everybody feels a taste of heaven now. So what do we got to do to make that happen?
Right.
And that involves everybody, right? You can't just say like, oh, that's the job of the priest. I'm telling you as a priest, like I'm only equipped to do so much. Mm-hmm. I'm not a mental health expert. I'm not an addiction counselor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there are people out there who are those experts. They have those passions. They have that interest. So like, what do we got to do to empower them to do their work to help? So I mean, to me, it just becomes a whole social transformation kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I really think that there are powers in the world that they really like the idea that it's like, oh, it's just a little individual private matter. You worship the Lord on your own. This is the thing you do on Sunday. But when you come out of your church on Sunday, here's how you're going to behave. And it's going to be the status quo behavior. And it's going to be, nobody, wants to change and affect that. I think it's no coincidence why these super rich pastors support super rich politicians that don't want to see any kind of economic shakeup.
Right.
Anyway, I'm on my soapbox. I'll get off of it for a little bit.
No, it's a very good soapbox. I like it. Cool. Well, that's the end of all my questions and talking points.
Good, man. It sounds like it's been a good experience for you.
It has been. It's been an interesting ride, because it's not like I I don't feel like I know everything or anything like that, but it has sort of, I don't know. I feel like there's a new journey to embark on, and I guess I just kind of want to understand it better, because I feel like the way I came to understand it was so much, like I said in the last episode, so much through like some kind of weird cultural osmosis, where it's like, if you just learn about the Bible just by just going to church every Sunday, it's like a pieces of puzzle of like a scattered puzzle that just like kind of coming together in weird spaces, you know, not like a thorough narrative. It's why I understand Buffy demonology better than Christian demonology.
Right.
You know?
There's a well, do you remember Terry Mattingly at PBA?
Oh yeah, I remember. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So his book Pop Goes Religion that came out a while back, I have a copy of it, and T Matt does an interview with a Roman Catholic priest on Left Behind.
Interesting.
And the Roman Catholic priest is like, yeah, he's like, many American Catholics believe this rapture stuff, even though it's not part of our theology, because he says we Catholics are terrible about talking about our own eschatology, and so people are just going to get it wherever they can.
That's interesting.
And
well, it's like Dante, right? Like that people started to latch on to Dante because
right.
they didn't have access to the Bible or the scriptures and stuff.
Right. And so, you know, part of it is on the church. We've done a really bad job of communicating this stuff. And, you know, I think a lot of it is actually out of convenience, right? Because as soon as the church becomes the tool of an empire, right, the preservation of status quo, the preservation of, you know, wealth and power and all of that becomes a very, you know, something people become very interested in. You know, the gospel as we're talking about it, and the gospel as it's presented is, I mean, there's a reason why the Roman Empire killed Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it wasn't just like, okay, well, you know, we'll do what you Jews want, right? Which is what we grew up with. But like the Romans saw a vested interest in killing this guy too, because they realized that he represented a threat to their hegemony and their power. Right. So, and there's a reason why Christians were being crucified by the Roman government in those early centuries, because you got people running around saying like, hey, this Palestinian guy who, you know, was dead but came back 3 days later, he's actually the king. He's actually the emperor. And now suddenly the empire's like, you know, we got to put a stop to that crap. Yeah. You know, if it didn't have an economic and political threat, they wouldn't have cared. Mm-hmm. But now Christianity is seen as a benign thing, or at worst, it's seen as the preserver of the status quo. I mean, gosh, just watch the videos from the Capitol riot. I know
it's becoming more of a political philosophy, but like a really like a prescribed philosophy, not something that actually describes something. You know?
Yeah. What is it? John Milbank, English theologian, whose work I really like. He says, Christianity does not offer a political critique. It is a political critique. He's a good old socialist. So
I think that's a good place to end that. Next week we're going to round this all off, or top this all off with a discussion of Pixar's Soul. So if you have a Disney Plus account, check that out. It's on there. Highly recommend it if you want to tune in, because we're going to get into spoiler territory. So check it out. Check it out. Join us again next week. Subscribe.
Oh, and also, you know, watch Cocoon.
One day we'll talk about Cocoon, but it is not this day. It's a hard movie to watch. Ron Howard is a very, very edgy filmmaker. You know, he doesn't pull any punches, that Ron Howard. He really tells it like it is, not afraid of any kind of critique, any kind of backlash, any kind of cultural responsibility. You know, it's like him and Pasolini. You probably don't know who that is, but
I don't.
Okay, don't look it up.
somewhere one of our listeners is like yelping with laughter.
Pasolini directed a movie called Sallow, 120 Days of Sodom. I just ended that. It's supposed to be considered like one of the most disturbing movies ever made, and Pasolini was murdered over it. So, in the streets by fascists. Anywho,
there you go.
That's where we end. So, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, do all that stuff, ring some bell. I don't know, don't ring the bell. It's so obnoxious. I started ringing bells on the YouTube channels I follow, and it's obnoxious. Don't do that. We're only once a week. You should know by now when we go up.
And also, I don't know what you do. If there's any goofy things to do, if you're like listening to us on your phone or whatever, but do those things too.
Subscribe,
because they're like all the bell ringing and all that. Oh, I guess they subscribe. Okay.
Yeah.
Thumbs up somewhere, right? Thumbs up on some of them. I don't know.
So, thank you so much, Father Chuck.
You're welcome, bro.
Thank you to our audience for listening, and we'll see you again next week. Good journey.
Good journey.